sides here. I'm Nadine Groenig, and I am the Tribal Outreach Coordinator for Save Our Schools Arizona. I am also the CEO for the Southwestern Institute for the Education of Native Americans. And so I'd like to thank you for joining us today. This is Indigenous Perspectives, the Importance of Voting. And so it's a very timely subject, as you know, because our national election is coming up November 3rd. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, but I want to let you know that we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll answer your questions. So just go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those a little later. We're also going to be recording this session. We are recording this session, and it will be available on YouTube. So if you would like to send the link out for that, let us know. Perhaps there's somebody who wasn't able to view this today, so we can do that a little later. So I'd like to first introduce Nikkie Whaley. It is how you pronounce it, right? Whaley, not
Whaley, like whale on
what
the
is
ocean.
Whaley? Okay, I thought that before, and then I could have sworn I got corrected. Okay, Nikkie Whaley. She's a board support and field services specialist for Arizona School Boards Association, where she serves as a statewide trainer and content lead for both their equity and annual conferences. She's a first-generation college student with a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's degree in public administration. She has over 15 years of experience working with youth and families from diverse backgrounds and is a school board member of the Washington Elementary School District. So thank you for joining us, Nikkie. Our next panelist is Senator Sally Ann Gonzales. She's a citizen of the Pasco Yaqui tribe of Arizona. She's a former tribal council member and public school educator, becoming the first Indigenous woman to be elected to the Arizona State Legislature in 1996. Senator Gonzales represents District 3. She is the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus and sits on the Commerce and Education Committee and is the ranking member of the Higher Education and Workforce Development Committee. At the national level, she is the chair of the Governmental Advisory Committee for the Environmental Protection Administration. As a former classroom teacher, Senator Gonzales continues to be a strong proponent for quality, equitable education for all. She continues to advocate for children, women, and elders. Senator Gonzales has sponsored and/or co-sponsored legislation to improve the lives of women and children and continues to support health for all, healthcare for all. And our third panelist today is Representative Arlando Teller. He's a member of the Navajo Nation. In 1995, he graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, becoming their first Native American graduate. In 2009, after working for the City of Phoenix's Aviation Department and Aviation Management intern for Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, he returned to the Navajo Nation as a senior transportation planner for the Navajo Nation Division of Transportation. He was eventually promoted to Deputy Division Director for the Transportation Division. Representative Teller is a Democratic member of the Arizona House of Representatives, representing District 7 since January 14, 2019. He was elected in 2018 to succeed retiring State Representative Winona Bonali. After being elected, he became a sitting member on the Land and Agriculture Committee and the Transportation Committee. So those are our panelists, and I welcome all of you here today. And let's start with, go ahead and go back and start with Nikkie. And if you'd just like to say just a few words about yourself by way of introduction, that would be great.
Sure. So my name is Nikkie Whaley. I'm with ASBA. I am originally from California, but I have been in Arizona's been my home for a little 11 years now, going on 11 years. So it is my home. I know that when I've been in other traditionally, you would explain where your people are from. So I will say that my mother's people are from the Agua Calientes area of northern Mexico. And my father's people are from Europe. And so I am originally from California, from Southern California, and I now live here in the Phoenix metro area. And I am the mother of 2 children. And like I said in my bio, a school board member of the Washington Elementary School District.
Great, thank you, Nikkie. So Senator Gonzales, would you like to say a few words? I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I just unmuted myself. Good evening. Thank you, Nadine, and for the invitation to Zoom with you tonight on the importance of Indigenous voting. Yes, I am. Let me introduce myself in my Yaqui language. Dios en Shaniabo, Inepo Senadora Sally Gonzales Teteac. I am originally from the little town of Guadalupe over by Phoenix and Tempe, and I have been living on the reservation outside of Tucson for the last 32 years. So raised my family out here. I am the proud mother of 5 children or daughters, and they have blessed my husband and I with 27 grandchildren. And so as you read earlier, I'm a former classroom teacher, and that's what really got me into policy changes and making a policymaker. And so I again thank you for the invitation, and we'll look forward to saying more about Indigenous voting.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. Representative Teller?
Oh, yat Nana, Nadine, yat Senator Gonzales and Nikki. Good to see you all this evening, as well as Kate. Sheya Arlando Teller Ninja, Nasht Ejedin at Kachit in Slon Headlini Bushchin, Twitchini the Shichedo Shin Dashnada Ekot out the Nenschle. Ado Ayisi Nashai Age in Letan, Shma A Clarotan Holya, 8 is Najlana that Naga. Shija Anderson Teller Holyandan, 8 Sepatan, Netlashka Tindan, Nagandan. I am a proud student, a graduate of a public school, Chinle High School, and I did go to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and I graduated in 1995. So from 1996 to 2 years ago, 24 years approximately, I've been in the transportation industry, both in the international airport, general aviation, with Caltrans in the Bay Area, and with Navajo Nation. So planes, trains, automobiles are definitely area of my expertise. And I moved back home 10 years ago after living off the reservation for over 26 years. And education is definitely very important to me and my family, as well as the communities that I represent. So I'm really glad to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh.
And I neglected to introduce myself, other than my name, my English name. So I'd like to say Guadalupe Hinameisuchitsa. I am a member of the Pueblo of Laguna in New Mexico. And unfortunately, I don't know my language fluently, so I can't say too much more than that in Laguna, but that's another topic for another day. We're going to be talking about the loss of native languages in sometime in October. So that'll come up. So today, of course, we're talking about the importance of voting, and as Senator Gonzales interjected, Indigenous voting. This program is Indigenous perspectives, so we want to get the perspective of both people who are Indigenous and those who work with the Indigenous community on why voting is important. So historically, many groups have had to fight for the right to vote. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about Native Americans and how we got the right to vote. So in 1870, I'm going to read some of this, the 15th Amendment granted all U.S. citizens the right to vote, regardless of race. Ironically, Native Americans weren't allowed to vote until 1924. So legislation said, the 15th Amendment said, we all had the right to vote in 1870, but Native Americans could not vote until 1924, and that's because they weren't citizens of the United States until that year. So I say ironically, obviously, because we were here first. So who should become citizens first? Well, that didn't happen. So it took over 40 years for all 50 states to allow Native Americans to vote, because the federal government allowed states to determine when and where, who among their citizens could vote. So in 1948, so this is 24 years later, the Arizona Supreme Court struck down a provision of its state constitution that kept Indians from voting. Other states eventually followed suit. Even with the lawful right to vote in every state, Native Americans suffered from the same mechanisms and strategies, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, fraud, and intimidation, that kept African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Sometimes we still have to fight those battles. But unfortunately, even after winning the right to vote, after so long, Native Americans are still among the lowest percentage of any group to actually vote. And that's something that we're hoping to change right through this discussion today. We want people to know how important each individual Indigenous person in the United States who is of legal age to vote, how important it is that we get your vote. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and, excuse me, address some of these questions. The first question is to everyone. So whoever wants to answer first, just raise your hand or start talking. So in this often volatile world, which we find is with protests and fires and all kinds of things going on right now, why is it more important than ever to vote in local, state, and national elections?
I'll go first. Nadine, I believe that it's very important for Native Americans to vote, Indigenous people to vote, because the laws that all governing bodies in Arizona and in the federal government really affect our lives on a daily basis. And sometimes as Native people living on the reservation, we think, oh, but we don't live out there, we live here on the reservation. But we tend to forget that for everything that we do during our day, we drive across. For me, it's just a few blocks, and then I'm in the city of Tucson or the county of Pima, and so all of the state laws and all of the city laws and county laws, you know, are pertinent to me, and they affect me as I drive down the road. And so it's really important for our people to realize that, and I want to say, from the perspective of being currently one of the longest serving legislators in our state legislature, is that we really we really make decisions that really affect our families, our kids, our grandkids on a daily basis. Like, for example, we in the workplace, we decide who gets unemployment insurance and who doesn't, and that's right now is really critical because a lot of people are out of work. In the grocery stores, or shopping, we get to decide how much taxes we pay, and unfortunately, taxes is a regressive tax, and so us poor people pay more taxes than the rich people. In my thinking, and we also do it in schools. You know, we affect children and their families every day because the legislature is the body that decides how many, for example, how many days are our children going to go to school every year. And one last thing, or two last things that I wanted to bring out in this this arena is in the doctor's office. The state legislature decides who is able to examine us at the doctor's office, what doctors, what education they have to have, whether they have to have a clearance, and how much training do they have before they can practice medicine. To me, that's important that we have people who are well trained to provide health care for us. And one last thing is that people don't realize, it's also the state legislature who decides who comes into our homes to take care of an elderly or somebody with disabilities. we decide that as well. What do they need? What credentials do they need? Do they have to have a fingerprint card and a clearance to be able to go into your home and provide these services? So these are really things that touch us on a daily basis, and why it's important that we elect people, that we vote and elect people that are going to think about us, the Indigenous community, and really pay attention to our needs.
Thank you very much. So it would also be important to know who's already in a legislative seat, who's running for the state legislature, what their thoughts are about the different things that impact us as individual Indigenous people, correct? So Representative Teller, Senator Gonzales gave us a good reason why we should always vote. Good reasons, several good reasons why we should always vote. But is it in particular more important now that we get even more people to vote, especially Native Americans, in your view?
Yes, I do. I believe, I mean, look, we have 22 tribes here in Arizona, 22 federally recognized tribes that are within the borders of Arizona. And we're not going to just limit to just the 22 tribes. There are a multitude of other tribes, families, sister tribes that are living in Phoenix, Tucson, Flagstaff, throughout the state. And we have federally recognized tribes that call Arizona home. So it is critical, particularly in rural Arizona, in my district, as well as districts that Sally represents, and some of the indigenous legislators that represent, that issues and services ranging from cradle to grave are particularly important for us to continue making our voices heard. And we are living in a time where it is becoming more difficult to fight for those services, regardless of where you live, metro or rural. And now we see this on Navajo, up in northern Arizona, that when a presidential candidate comes to Navajo, a senatorial candidate comes to Navajo, and we get behind that particular Democratic candidate, we wait the very next day for the Navajo vote to come in. And we see that the power of Indigenous votes coming in. And now is a time for us to really move and affirm our language, our voice, our issues that need to be addressed at the state capitol, and issues that Senator Gonzales has shared. Those are, issues we see within the city as well as at home, but out in rural Arizona. So yes, those votes are very important. Those concerns and issues need to be addressed. We talk about infrastructure, the lack of broadband throughout Arizona. In rural Arizona now, we have kids on Zoom that have no infrastructure. The community doesn't have an infrastructure. We have to address that. We have to address school bus routes that are questionable, passable, if not during inclement weather. We have medical issues, hospitals, IHS. We have a multitude of jurisdictional issues, not just in the state and in rural urban Phoenix, but when you go out to rural Arizona, you have multi-jurisdictional issues, and addressing those, going from trust to fee to county to private. One road could pass all those jurisdictions. Now we have to address that at a state level. And it would take someone like a constituent to come to us and saying, Mr. Teller, Ms. Gonzales, this is what I have to deal with on a daily basis. And that constituent will vote for a change. And we hope to support that person's effort for their livelihood. So it's really important for us to vote from Four Corners all the way down to Yuma, and so on and so forth. So it is important for us to really express the need for the youth, not the youth, but the Indigenous vote to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. So if a person doesn't vote, they're essentially leaving it up to other people to make those decisions for them, right? Or for things to be left the way they are, good or bad or ugly, you know, whatever that might be. So your voice is your vote is your voice as to whatever different issues you have. Nikki, would you like to add something to that before we move on? Or
Sure. I think the question of why is it, first of all, that the world is volatile right now, and why is it so important to vote? I think that you kind of said a few of those things at, in the beginning, which is there has only recently have many communities of color, including the Indigenous people, been able to vote.
Right.
It's only been 100 years in this nation. And if you really want to count, you know, with all of the disenfranchising that happened for a large portion of that time, the access to the vote, even today, can be hindered, especially when we're in some of these rural communities where access to polling places, making sure that your mail is going to come, making sure that you even get aware of some of the candidates and the information that is coming. If you're a Native American today and you get that ballot in your hand, you have an obligation to vote because you're lucky that you even have that ballot in your hand and you have access to turn it in. And that's so important, especially right now, because there's fewer numbers, right? The fewer numbers, there's less people to pick up the slack, right? You're not going to be represented if you don't vote because there's fewer people that can vote on your behalf. Other communities, the white community, the Hispanic community, voting is important there. And I know in the Hispanic community, we're doing the get out to vote, but there's enough that there's still some representation there. Native Americans really need to fight to get representation at the state level and not just around the tribal areas. Native Americans need to be voting and running in areas outside of their tribal, you know, neighbors. There's Native Americans in Phoenix that could run. There's Native Americans in some of our real remote areas that may not be as attached to a nation or closely to a nation, but they need to feel compelled to vote in those, even though they're not tied close to their nation, and they need to be compelled to run in those areas. It's important now, as the senator and the representative explains, because at this particular moment, education funding and healthcare funding for our Native American students, our Native American families is critical. We have COVID-19 ravaging through the Navajo Nation and other Indigenous communities that are not getting the same access to care as other communities are. We have school right now that has been, for safety reasons, moved to online, but we know that the infrastructure, bandwidth, access to Wi-Fi in those communities in the rural areas are not there. And the way that we get the funding for the infrastructure is through putting people in office that are going to give us the funds and listen to our demands. And you do that through numbers and you do that through dollars. And since a lot of our communities don't have a lot of dollars, we have to do it in numbers. So that's so important right now.
very, very good point. And I want to interject here how it's very much related to what you just said, how important it is for us to complete the census. So the census, it directly affects those same things. It affects how much representation we have in Washington through our legislature, and it affects our education funding. So the biggest supplemental educational funding source is Title I under the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the money that Arizona gets, and then the money that trickles down to our school districts and our Title I schools is based on census poverty data. So if we're running away from the census taker, we're not getting counted. That means not all of our students are going to be served. And like you said, it also affects healthcare and other things. So we've been talking so far a lot about the legislative level, the state legislature, and a little bit about the federal level. But I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about school boards, governing boards. And Nikki represents the Arizona School Board Association, and she also serves on one. So I wanted to hear, you know, your views on this, but I would think that there's some people, I mean, if they're not voting in the presidential election, they may not even think about voting for a school board member who's running for, or somebody who's running for a school board position. So why don't you tell us why it's so important that they do, that they give that some thought as to how they choose board members and why they should vote, and
Right.
what impact that has on their children and the school.
So I think that you're right. A lot of people don't think about school boards. They may not even know that they exist. They know that they have a state senator and a state representative. They probably know they have, they definitely know they have federal representatives, but understanding your local representatives, your city council, your county supervisors, your school board members, they play significant roles. And in fact, you know, one could argue that they are the boots on the ground in terms of how that funding actually gets spent, because whatever money the federal government is giving to the states and then the state legislator moves down to the local governments, ultimately it's going to be those school board members in this example that are going to decide, okay, this is how much money we got for education from the state, how are we actually going to spend these dollars? And that's a local control issue. The reason why we have school boards is the idea is that each local community is going to set their expectation of what a quality education looks like for their students. They're going to put policies in place. They're going to set goals. They're going to spend money in the way that they feel is the best way to educate their children. The school board makes that decision. And that is why if you are interested in that local of what's happening in your children's classroom, you're not looking at the state. There's certain things that are at the state, but making sure that those are happening, that's on the local decision. If you want to ensure, for example, you brought up the loss of language and the lack of cultural inclusion in some of our classrooms. Those are local control issues that are made at the local level, at school board level. And so if you are skipping through, you know, if you're voting for president, you look for your senator and then you just turn your ballot in because you know, don't really want to know about you don't know much about the judges, you don't know about school board, or some people even think because they don't have kids that they don't vote for school board. School board represents everybody, any taxpayer in that area. That money is going to your local schools. They represent you too, whether or not you still have schools in the system, have kids in the system or not, or if you've ever had kids. So it's really important to recognize that those down the ballot votes do matter because it all works together. These people influence what these people get, influence what these people get, influence what that looks like in your day-to-day life. And school board members are so critical in determining what your children's education is going to look like.
Exactly. Well, that's what Save Our Schools Arizona network is about, is ensuring that public school dollars, taxpayer dollars, stay in public schools. But over $264 million have already come out of public schools and gone into private schools through the voucher system. So that's one thing people may not be aware of. And like you said, whether you have children or not, you're paying taxes that support the schools in your local area and the children who are getting educated there. So it is really important to know, if you care at all, about what's happening there, to know who's running and the decisions they're making, and to have your voice heard through voting.
Don't make it easy. Unlike the state representatives, statewide races, that voter guide that comes out doesn't include information on the school board members. So they don't make it easy for voters either. But one way that you can look into that is by going to your county superintendent of education. If you go to your county school superintendent, they generally have information on everybody that's running. I know in Maricopa, they post the candidates, but it is difficult because school board races usually don't get the same funding to do ads and things like that other races do. And as I said, the state voter guide doesn't include that local information.
So should people who want to know about candidates go to board meetings to find out?
I think one good way to learn about kind of what the board does is to go to board meetings, but I am going to put in the chat the Arizona School Board Association webpage. You can learn a lot about what school boards do. And you can also find out who the different county superintendents of schools are, because it's at that county level that you'll really get information about the people that are trying to run in your local communities.
Okay, great. Well, and through Sienna, the Southwestern Institute for the Education of Native Americans that I run, it's a nonprofit organization. We do a lot of different trainings, and one of them is about roles and responsibilities, and that includes school board members. So, Senator Gonzales, you had something you wanted to add?
I wanted to add that I agree with Nikki and everything that both of you said on the importance of voting up and down the ballot and on the backside of the ballot, and because that's where some of these very important names are electing our school board. It's very important. And one of the places that, you know, Zoom, one good thing about this pandemic is that we are Zooming a lot, and it's getting a lot more people to get to know the candidates. And one place to look at this, I know here in Southern Arizona, the League of um, the League of Women Voters did a forum for the TUSD school board, and I'm sure they're doing other ones. So if you look at their web page also, you can look at for Tucson and Tucson Unified School District, the second school district in the state, I believe. You can see the 6 candidates and make your choice by that. There's none of them of the candidates are indigenous, but but I was able to view that forum, and you can really tell those candidates that would be supportive to indigenous communities and people of students of color, and before lifting them up and in their educational efforts.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. I have opened the chat box because there was a comment that's specific to what we're talking about now. It says, as a former school board member, an election never took place because no one ever ran. And I don't know where the person is from. It says every election was called off and everyone was appointed for many years. If we want to see change in our tribal communities, it will take education of what their vote means, and it impacts their communities because most people have no idea. Well, that's why we're doing this session tonight, but there will be many more efforts. But it also says it took years for our state reps and senators to come to our community before that. We didn't know who they were. So that's kind of to your point, Representative Teller, earlier, that when they do come to the Navajo Nation, for example, then more people are aware and more people become active.
Right. And so particular to that comment on Facebook, it sounds like a situation that occurred in the district that I work in, Legislative District 7. And so I'm pretty honest on when I say my wheelhouse is transportation. And education is a passion, but it's not like Nikkie, you know, where it's a wheelhouse. And so that includes the alphabet soup that comes into the education industry. So and so SOS has been really helpful in making sure that I am prepared to communicate on educational issues. So we've gone to several school districts in Legislative District 7, and the particular district I'm thinking of that this might relate to is in the Peach Springs on Whaley Nation. And I initially went up there just to show introduce myself to the tribal leadership, and so they shared with me a situation that is occurring at that school district. So I started following through on that and making it more myself more available for meeting with that school district and also with that tribe on this particular issue. And so that was a situation that has occurred, and I've traveled up there often and addressed it with the Department of Education, and so it in that situation, I'm really encouraging particular members of the community or the community in general to run for the school board. And from what I understand, the county superintendent is appointing non-tribal members to that school board, and that's really interesting for me to try to comprehend, because those particular appointees are not from the community. They're not tribal members, and so I have some reservation on sharing specifically how I really feel about that. But it is important that the person who's interested in running the school board as a school board member is from that community, so they understand the the situation of the community. They understand the limitations and challenges that a child or a parent goes through in that community. And so it is important that, you know, as legislators, that we encourage the community to find within themselves someone that they can see being a school board member that can voice the concerns and address the issues and also share the triumphs of that school. That's really important. Sharing the issues and concerns is one thing, but getting on top of a mountain and sharing the triumphs of that school district, that encourages so much more than always complaining and constantly sharing the challenges. I think the triumphs are very important. So with this particular comment on Facebook, it is very welcome, and I appreciate whoever shared that, and we certainly will do our very best as legislators to continue going to districts that require some special focus on. Now, that is on one end of the district. On the other is, as we talked about, state funding, and my effort and the efforts of many is to focus on public school for public funding from the state. Now, I am not happy with something that occurred last session, and SOS knows this. The funding going to a parochial school 2 miles off the Arizona border, that is a definite concern that, and I believe if we're a majority in the House and with the help of the senator, we have to take a look at that situation and really work with SOS, work with organizations on addressing that one thing, because it's just not New Mexico. There's 5 other states that border Arizona and Mexico to the south of us. And that just set precedent. Do we start sending our state funds to other states and other countries?
Yeah, it's bad enough our public school funds go to private schools in Arizona, but now they're going out of state as well.
Exactly.
And we do have a presentation that we've done in the past on that particular subject. So you can find that on Save Our Schools Arizona webpage, and I'm happy to do the presentation for anybody who wants us to do that. Nikki, you're wanting to say something.
I do. I want to chime in. I need to get in there. So first, I just want to echo what Representative Teller was saying in terms of the importance of supporting public schools. It often gets twisted around that we don't want to give people choice, but there is choice within public schools. We have open enrollment in this state, so you have that opportunity. But I think it's also important to understand that in many of our communities, especially towards our tribal nations, there isn't a whole lot of choice because you're not seeing some of these big private charters set up school there. They are just taking money from the public schools, and then the charters around more urban areas are getting some of that money, right? Or they're going across, the border. So it's so important that we protect public schools, because the kids that lose out when public funds are getting taken from public schools are the folks with the least amount of choice. The idea is that you're going to take these different vouchers and things and move to a different, better school. But if you look about who has access to that, who has even access to those quote unquote better schools, or who can afford it even with the voucher, that's a whole different ballgame. And we know that our communities of color, our natives, our Hispanic, our African-American students are not seeing the same benefits that program was supposed to do. And in fact, they are most likely to be in our public schools, which continually get those resources taken away. So I did want to mention that, because that is an important understanding of, and that decision gets made at the state level. And that has nothing to do with me at the local level as a school board member, because we only can play with the money that we get. And when we get a lot of questions about why can't you do this? Why aren't you doing this? And it really comes down to, we only have so many dollars. And one thing COVID has definitely shown us is that we rely on our public schools to do so much more than educate our students. They need to provide childcare, a safe place to go. They provide food, they provide mental health access, they provide so many different things, and they're not funded for those things. but they use their budgets to meet those needs because they understand how much that impacts the education of students. And we can't do more unless we get more. So with that, you know, I'll put a pin on that. I think the other thing to remember to the comment on Facebook is we do have a lot of races that go uncontested. So 2 people are running, there's 2 seats available. They'll call off the election and they will give it to the 2 people that submitted their signatures. That happens all the time. What's also happening right now, you talk about the successes. Well, right now is a tough time to get people to want to sit on school boards. I'll tell you that with COVID going on. So we also had a lot of people that either couldn't get signatures due to COVID, they couldn't meet the threshold, or they're not interested, you know, going into the field. And so there's a lot of vacancies where there's not even anybody that went out and got signatures. The county superintendent of schools is going to place people there. And that's why that local, when we talk about local elections, voting for your local county school superintendent is so important, because when there's no school board members, that elected position is putting people in school boards, and those people are making decisions. And depending on who's in that office, they could or could not do practices that are going to put somebody, as Representative Teller said, as from that community. I mean, legally they have to live within the borders, but in terms of being connected with the students that are the majority in that community, that's not necessarily the case. I'll say for myself, one of the things that I like to do is people like Save Our Schools, and there's a lot of other organizations that are working really hard to get Black, Indigenous, and other people of color into races, school board races and others, because there is a fear of getting into that. I know that I was afraid to run for school board, and I did a Hispanic Leadership Institute through Valle del Sol, which encouraged us to run for offices or to sit on public boards. And even through going through that training, it still took me several years, because it's a very intimidating process. And I think that for many of our communities of color, they don't feel like they can really be part of that process. And so it's important for us, it's important for them to see people like Senator Gonzales or Representative Teller go out to their communities, even if it's not their community, but going out to other communities in the state to show them that it is possible to overcome the barriers. That's part of the reason why the Arizona School Board Association will come out and speak to any community group that wants us, and we provide the information, because we want to help eliminate some of those barriers and make the process more seem more doable, because it is an intimidating process. And the hope is that if we get more people of color, more Native and Indigenous people to be on school boards, that brings a new perspective and a lens. That's not to say that a white board member or a Black or Hispanic board member doesn't care or can't advocate for Indigenous priorities, but it will definitely bring a different lens when that person has that lived experience that comes and brings that. And it also is a lot harder to ignore the needs of a population when you have a member of that population sitting on the board next to you. And so I can't advocate enough for the importance of, if you're in a means to support and encourage people to run for office, to do that, and to provide them with the different, because there are people out there that will help first-time candidates trying to get into this process.
Yeah, well, that kind of speaks to one of my questions too. I mean, about, well, you're saying it's an intimidating process to run for a school board member or any other seat, elected a seat. What about people who are intimidated just by voting, the voting process? They don't know enough about that. And as we opened the session, we talked about the fact that there's voter intimidation, there's a problem getting people actually to the polls. If someone isn't able to vote for them on their own, you know, getting a proxy or somebody else to be able to vote for them, absentee ballots, all of that kind of thing. What do we tell somebody who says, I'm afraid of the process, or I don't know enough about it, or I don't know where to go, or how about I have no idea who to vote for? You know, what would you tell somebody if they asked you that or said that to you? Senator Gonzales, what would you say?
Well, it is an intimidating process, and for Indigenous people, it is an intimidating process that has been in place for a long time. There's a lot of distrust in government because of our history with the federal government, our history with the state government that you mentioned before. They didn't let us vote until 1948, I believe it was. And so it's intimidating, and there is a lack of trust. But we as Indigenous people have to really, this is why forums like tonight, like what you're putting together, are very important, so that we can discuss some of these fears, so that we can tell our viewers, your viewers, to where to go for getting some help. There, one of the there's different places where you can go to get some help. Or you don't know about the candidates, you don't know about the issues. Well, you can ask your family, you can ask your friends, you can ask your neighbors. Some neighbors are really up on the issues because they're on CNN and the local news all the time, and so they're really up on the issues and at the state government, and they watch what happens up at the state capitol when we're in session, or they zoom in into the district school board meetings, and so they know what's happening there. And I, as a senator and a candidate, get a lot of people asking me, I don't know these people. What can you tell me about them? For school board members, for representatives, for all these things. So you can really go to a lot of people and get some help. Besides the clean election guide that Nikkie talked about, that comes in the mail, that you can read up, but not all of the races are in that booklet. Only the state races and the legislative races are in that booklet. And so, but don't feel afraid to reach out to people that you know and ask them about it, because some of them may know about some races, and other ones may know about other races and other issues. So it's important to talk to as many people as you can.
Well, I've noticed that there's a lot of sharing on Facebook, and I definitely do that myself. I post a lot of information on Facebook, so people can, and you can get both sides of an argument that way. So
That's true.
unfortunately, sometimes they're not real pleasant to read, but that's the volatility we talked about before. So since we started a little bit late, I want to I'll go till about 6:05, and I wanted to talk a little bit about tribal council, about how important it is to elect good representation on tribal councils. So if somebody is thinking about that, looking at the candidates for a tribal council, what are the most important factors that they should consider about the person or persons running for a tribal council? Representative Teller, can you speak to that?
Yes, thank you. In my previous life, working for Navajo DOT, I worked really closely with the Navajo Nation Council. It went from 88 to 24, from the first time I stepped foot back on home and worked for Navajo DOT to when I left Navajo DOT. And what I see on Navajo and in also other tribes is that the youth are coming home. And we're coming home to make a difference. We're going to do our darndest to make a difference. And some of us don't speak our mother's tongue as effectively and efficiently as those that have been in the council for a very long time. But we have experience and knowledge that we believe that could be the best benefit for the community. And so on Navajo, I've seen, and I know that there are several delegates, including the speaker, who doesn't speak Navajo. Yet they still believe in the fundamental law, the philosophies of Navajo as the foundation of their efforts. And I believe that having young, youthful delegates who represent a particular part of a nation's region that are doing it for the best interest of their community is very important. And understanding that and acknowledging that you, if you're a candidate, that you do have both feet in both worlds and are able to balance the stresses from both worlds so that you can come out of that effort with an opportunity for a community. I think that's really important. And a lot of the youth are coming back home. They want to make a difference in where they grew up. They want to make a difference where grandma grew up. Now we go back to the election issues. My concern is, and I've shared this on the floor, is some of us have family members that don't speak English. They still speak Navajo or their indigenous language. So how do we guide those and share with them without too much influence and prejudice? This is who the candidates are, and start talking to them. And like for me, it would be Navajo. This is a person who's a Chintaloy. He's an elephant. He's a Republican. This one is a donkey. He's a Democrat. Those conversations all go into having to advise an elder on voting. So yeah, I encourage the youth to come home. Definitely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, that's one of the things. I was, as you all know, I was formerly the Director of Indian Education for the State Department of Education. And prior to that, I was a Title I specialist for 9 years. And all my LEAs, my local educational agencies, were on Navajo Nation and in other reservation communities. And one of the biggest complaints I had from people talking about their school board representatives or tribal council members was nepotism and the lack of turnover. That it's the same people all the time making the same decisions, and they get people on these boards or councils that are relatives or that somebody they owe a favor to, or somebody who has dirt on them that they don't want them to share. So, all the wrong reasons, basically, from my perspective. And so maybe you want to speak to that a little bit, but how do we make that change? Is it the youth coming back, the youth going maybe off to college, getting some education, some experience, coming back, knowing that they don't want that to continue themselves? And so I would think it would be very hard to make a decision if I'm somebody who doesn't know that much about the family, or I do know, and they're just going to have the same old people, or somebody I know on the council is just going to vote the same way as that person, for some of the reasons I stated before. Is it possible, do you think, or do you see a trend toward going away from that? Anyone can speak to that.
I sure hope so. I sat on the tribal council before going on to the state level, state government, again, it's really important for all voters in our communities when we're voting for tribal council to really get to know the candidates and where they're at with different issues, because all of the things that you mentioned are true and have happened in my community. But I think that that our youth is coming back and getting closer to or getting to learn their responsibility of voting for voting, period, whether it's for tribal council, for any of the other candidate, positions that we talked about already at the state level, local level, and at the federal level. But it's really important that we really choose people that are going to not necessarily know everything going into it, but that's willing to learn about how the state affects us, how the local government in school districts affect us, and at the federal level, and how they can work together with all of the council to really affect changes at all of those governmental levels, because they owe it to all of their tribal members to do so. And so you know, it's really I'm hoping that this, one of the things that the pandemic did again for our Pascuayaki tribal election, which was on June 1st, is because we weren't able to knock on doors, there was a lot of Zooming going on, and I think a lot of people got to meet a lot more of the candidates in that way. And so I think there was a lot more participants in our vote, in our election this year. And so I hope that trend continues, not besides the pandemic, because I hope the pandemic, you know, we get over it as soon. But, you know, there's been some positive things, and those are some of them.
All right, great. Anybody want to add to that? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
as far as, you know, I completely encourage the youth to come home and participate in their tribal election process. On Navajo, prior to COVID, it was a festive opportunity to set up shop right outside the border of the voting line and put up a tent. And I'm talking about personal experience. Mom and family are cooking, and I'm feeding my supporters that are going in. And this is, and you can, you know, Senator Pashtakai will share this as well, that on Navajo, it's a very festive, you know, we feed everyone, and Mom and her sisters, my aunts and my cousins are all cooking up a storm. And my job is to, you know, if I sit back down, they get me back up, say hello to your supporters and push me out. And we're saying hello. And it happens from the moment the sun comes up to the moment the sun goes down. And the primary and the general are like that. And with this COVID, you know, really affecting and inflicting nations, tribal nations throughout the United States, but particularly in Arizona and in Navajo, we, the Navajo Nation Council, decided to do away with a general election and just do one general, in the primary election, just do one general election. So that's what happened. It cut down the choice, you know, from voting on this day to having that general election in November. So it has affected us deeply. But that shouldn't discourage folks to run for office or voting.
Okay, great. Well, so there's hope.
Yes.
Yeah, there's always hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so yeah, we only have how much? Oh, actually, we're done. We went past the time I thought it was. Obviously, we're having really great conversation here. I was looking on the live feed. They're not so much in the chat box here, but the live feed, a lot of great comments. So, and I'm grateful for one in particular that said I was a great Title I specialist. So thank you for that, Chris Osgard.
Hi, Chris. Oh, I love Chris at Peon. Yes, yeah.
Yes, he's great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. What do you guys think? Should we do another session on this? Or have we exhausted everything we have to say about it? No?
Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
We did not exhaust everything, and I think we should have another one.
And I would be happy to talk about how to run, what a school board does and how to,
Yes.
I mean, you do that too, Nadine. I don't want to step on your toes, but I'm happy to work with you to do that.
Yes.
I did put a couple links in the list about
Yes.
some voting guides for Native American natives vote. And then I also put an article in about some organizations that specifically help diverse groups run for office, first time people running for office.
Wonderful. Thank you
That's
very
great.
much. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd like to encourage another session. I mean, I think we need to talk about some of the losses, like the the funding going out to New Mexico. I think we need to talk about what that impact is to local public schools and how we all can work together to address, future stuff like that. That won't happen. So I think this is a wonderful dialogue. Thank you very much, Nadine. Fantastic work. And Nikki, it's really nice meeting you. And Senator Gonzales, it's so wonderful to see you. Just put a smile on my face.
Thank you, Representative Teller. Again, Nadine, we didn't even finish some of the questions that you gave to us. So
really good.
Please, have another session. I'd be happy to come back and talk about some specifics on how council members can affect all those governments that we talked about specifically, and give examples and more reason why it's important for us to Indigenous people to vote. This year we're voting for our lives, and so we it's really important that we talk more about different issues, and we certainly just didn't touch the tip of the iceberg, and so we need to come back and talk some more.
That sounds good to me. So I will definitely be in touch. I'll be asking for dates and availability for you guys, and we'll do this again.